Oh my goodness. So many people.
Good morning.
Good morning.
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 Good morning, everyone.
Hello.
Morning.
Good morning. Welcome, everyone. We'll take about another minute to get people in the room, and then we'll get started. Okay, let's get started. Good morning and welcome to the second annual Northwest Illinois Volunteerism Conference. I'm Pam Clark-Reidenbach with the Northern Illinois Center for Nonprofit Excellence, and I also want to put a shout out to Billy Callahan, who's also on staff at NICNE. NICNE and the Leadership Exchange on Volunteerism participants, with support from Serve Illinois Commission, AJ Gallagher and Company, and Imperial Punch of Rockford, present a full year of online interactive volunteer management programming focused on creating a culture of connection and inclusion in volunteerism. Each monthly session includes a 1-hour presentation, followed by a 1-hour group discussion, moderated today by our friend Martesha Brown. We ask all participants to mute their computers for better reception for all, and to type questions into the chat box. You'll have the opportunity at the end of the presentation and during the discussion to unmute and participate in Q&A. So let's get started. It is truly my pleasure to introduce today's presenter, who will be speaking on the topic of "They're not a frill if you're using them right, how to save money and get more done using high skills volunteers." Our presenter for this morning is Keri Kleiman, principal and founder of NFP Consulting. Kelly is a lawyer educated at the University of Chicago and has more than 30 years of experience in the nonprofit sector. Please give a warm welcome to Keri Kleiman.
Thank you all. Good morning. I have indeed been in the nonprofit sector, it seems like since before the glaciers melted, but I would like to introduce this by saying that it was much more inspired by my own experience as a volunteer than even anything that I did in working with clients, because I regard myself as a high skill volunteer and found quite a bit of unnecessary, quite a bit of unnecessary frustration in trying to work with agencies and give them the best of myself. So that is the origin of this presentation. Billy, if you'd put me on the first slide, please. And there we go. What are high skills volunteers good for? And I promise I'm not going to read my presentation. I know you can all read. Here's the thing. I mean, none of us sits in a strategic planning session and says, I wonder how we can stuff more envelopes. But we often kind of give that level of project to people who volunteer. And really what we should do is use them on major projects. And if you don't want to stick with stuffing envelopes, you want to match your major goals to skills that are offered by volunteers. Next slide, please. Often, and I'm sure many of your organizations have already done this, we give challenging work to student interns, to law clerks, to trainees of various kinds, but seem to have a difficulty giving challenging work to adults. And, you know, sometimes that's an issue because volunteer coordinators have hammers, so everything looks like a nail. And the hammer often, and I know many of you are volunteer coordinators and probably the rest of you are executive directors. Often the volunteer coordinator is sort of given the job of finding volunteers to accomplish these menial tasks that we don't want to be bothered with and keep the volunteers out of our hair. And if you think I'm making that up, that really does come directly from my experience as a volunteer. It's important that the volunteer coordinator's role is recognized and redefined if necessary, to recognize that she or he is the gateway to your most valuable resource, which is these people. And we don't use volunteer coordinators that way because they're busy doing other things, because the people who are supervising interns and law clerks are your substantive staff, whereas the people who are assigned to supervise your adult volunteers are volunteer coordinators. And so that's sort of, that means that people feel alienated from the central work of the institution. It's also true that there's a fair amount of status concerns. That is, adults are more concerned, or high skill volunteering adults are more concerned with than students are with whether they're being treated appropriately. And so it's something that the supervisory issue can handle a little bit better. It's very important that you use volunteers, high skill volunteers, for projects for which you're understaffed. But we'll get to that in 1 minute. Next slide, please. This is volunteer coordinators have a hammer. This is the hammer, get rid of menial tasks. And this is redefining your volunteer coordinator. Next slide, please. Find projects, not tasks. If I don't say anything else today, if you don't hear anything else, please think about it in these terms. This is the perfect solution to projects that you have been meaning to get done, and for which you're understaffed. And whether that's, you know, a discrete project or simply aid to the overwhelmed staff members, it's a way to use people so that they understand that they're being used meaningfully. If you need a part-time coordinator of major gift solicitation, use a volunteer. If you need more marketing outreach, use a volunteer. And the only exception I'll make to that, and I know many of you have probably tried this, is don't use even high skill volunteers for grant writing, except in really exceptional cases, which is like an experienced grant writer or a foundation program officer is your volunteer. I think you'll find lots of writers come to you, and I'm a writer myself, a journalist, come to you and say, oh, surely I can do grant writing. And you need to explain to them that no matter how skilled they are, grant writing is a very unusual form of writing, that it includes lots of button pushing and buzz phrase using to appeal to the institutional funders, and that their skills will actually disqualify them from doing it well. And the last thing I'll say is analogy to your use of the board of directors. Many of you, the executive directors among you, surely sit in board meetings where board board members say, why don't we do blah, blah, blah that we're not already doing? And often they do that as though they're not aware that you're already incredibly understaffed and overworked. And so many of you have probably figured out that one of the easiest ways to handle that is to say, that is a great idea. Why don't you do it? Well, if you're used to asking your board of directors, which after all is a group of high skill volunteers, to take care of projects, that's something that you can do equally well with volunteers who come to you who don't want to serve on the board of directors. Next slide, please. How to identify major projects. And all of you, I'm sure you've been in a million seminars where people say, okay, let's talk about the difference between essential and important. Well, fortunately, you can use high skill volunteers on both essential and important. Why did I say essential and important? What I mean is urgent and important. Urgent and important. I don't know why I wrote that. It's like essential and important mean the same thing. Duh. Urgent and important. And that's why I say discrete tasks on which volunteers can make progress. You know, if you say to somebody, why don't you revise our bylaws? They will disappear into a rabbit hole and never emerge. I swear the function of bylaws is to make people disappear. If you'd like to make your volunteers disappear, just give them your bylaws to revise. So what you want is something where, okay, we need somebody to design the spring mailing, okay? That has a schedule, it's a discrete project, it's important, and it has a timetable so that no one will disappear indefinitely. If you feel that you really do need your bylaws rewritten, then first of all, and we'll talk about this more in a minute, you want to put more than one person on the project. And second of all, you want to put timetables on it, because as I say, otherwise you will never see these people again. Now, often we think to ourselves, oh, well, you know, this task or this project requires knowing about fundraising, or this project requires knowing a great deal about our substantive area. But I think if you think about skills, skills are broader spectrum than that. So, you know, if somebody comes to you and says, hi, I have organized, you know, the logistics for UPS, then the word that you need to hear is organized, or the word that you need to hear is logistics. You don't need to hear fundraising. You think, okay, what do we do in fundraising that requires being organized? To which, of course, the answer is everything. And so if you talk with your prospective volunteers about what they've done, the words you're listening for are I organized this, I managed this, I led a team that did this. And so you want to be very clear about the skills that are required, but you also want to be very broad in the skills that are required. The most satisfactory volunteer experience I ever had, I went to the Lakeview YMCA where I was a member and I wanted to contribute something, and handed my resume to the executive director. And when we had a meeting a week or 10 days later, she handed me a list of projects that they wanted to get done that they thought matched my skills. In that case, it was, oh, you used to be a real estate lawyer. We're trying to figure out why our single room occupancy hotel isn't full. So off I went and, you know, interviewed people and figured things out and came back and did a report and didn't need any more supervision than that, which goes to this question about tasks that can be done independently. And after the board of directors listened to my report, they put me on the board of directors. And that's one of the reasons that I think you want to treat high skill volunteers as the fabulous resource that they are, because you can put them on the board of directors ultimately, or even if you don't, you've gotten very high level people who are very committed to the work of your organization. I'm just going to take a pause here. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir, but I can't help it. I remember reading a piece in the New York Times shortly after 9/11, in which people were very interested in doing anything that they could to support the nation. People were donating blood. People were trying to figure out ways in which they could express their patriotism and their desire to contribute. And they quoted some very high-level person at, I don't know, the American Red Cross or something, who said, oh my God, I just don't know what to do with all these volunteers. It's really, it's just, I wish they would think of something else to do. And I thought, yeah, and you really wish that you were not standing in a hailstorm of $100 bills, because, volunteers are so great. And we waste them so frequently, and we treat them so frequently like a problem instead of an opportunity. Now, when I say we, I really don't mean anybody on this call, because if you felt that way, you wouldn't be on this call. But I'm sure that you are surrounded by people, probably, members of your substantive program team who think, oh yeah, volunteers, what a pain in the ass. And getting across that volunteers are a resource rather than a problem depends on your identifying major projects for them. And that includes projects that give them an opportunity to lead. Now, may I have the next slide, please? How to integrate volunteers into projects. The most important thing that you can do is to identify a volunteer who can be a leader. And until you do that, you will need to keep other volunteers in abeyance. Fortunately, it's not all that difficult to identify people who have led teams before, who have managed before, who have organized before. And that's why I say, keep your ears open for those words. Once you identify a volunteer leader, and it can be co-leaders on any given project, you let them supervise other volunteers. Now, there are a couple of advantages of this. One is that volunteers listen to one another sometimes better than they listen to staff. So a volunteer leader can say to another volunteer, what is the matter with you? I asked you to do blah, blah, blah by blah, blah, blah date, and you didn't do it. And that is something that's very difficult for staff members to say, even volunteer coordinators. So you get more accountability through a volunteer leader than you do working directly with every individual volunteer. Also, it minimizes the amount of time that any of your staff, whether the volunteer coordinator or program staff, has to spend supervising. And I don't in any way minimize the amount of effort and time that goes into supervising volunteers, high skill or otherwise. That's the reason that people have the attitude of this woman in New York who wishes the volunteers would go away, because what she doesn't see is a way to make use of those people without interfering with everything else she's already doing. My recommendation for the way to do that is to identify a leader or leaders, make sure that that person is very clear on what it is you want him or her to accomplish. And then you hold them accountable for the results. And again, it's easier to hold one person accountable than 15. This notion of a volunteer leader and independent work is why the old ladies who lunch model of setting up benefit events works so well. Because, you would get a group of people together and one of them was the chair of the benefit event. And, many of us still do this, but it's slightly less common than it used to be. And if they want to sit around for 4 hours discussing the color of the tablecloths, they can do that. The volunteer leader spends the 4 hours and you, overworked staff members, do not. Next slide, please. So how to identify volunteers who are eligible for leadership positions. The first is, as you see, significant and predictable time to give. And again, going back to my own personal experience, I walked into the ACLU of Illinois and said, hi, I'm prepared to treat this as a part-time job. When you hear that, that's a person that you need to pay attention to. The ACLU kind of went, oh, really? Now, it happened that suddenly a project erupted for which they had not staffed, and they threw me into that position, and that worked out very well. But that was sort of the luck or disluck of the draw. You're not always going to have things explode in your face. And of course, we don't want you to always have things explode in your face, but you may always have people walking in the door. Now, when I was listening to last month's presentation, somebody made mention of RAGE donations. And I suspect many of you have had RAGE volunteers as well, whether dealing with social justice or racial justice issues, or just, people who are enraged because they're trapped in their house by COVID-19. And so you will have people come to you who do have significant and predictable time to give. But then the next question is, do they have skills pertinent to the project? And as we talked about, define those skills broadly, and it will be easy to connect them to things. It's tempting whenever somebody with a lot of skills walks in the door to think, why don't we put this person on the board? Here's an accountant, and we need a new treasurer on our board. Well, there are two reasons why that might not be the right thing to do. One is often the skills that somebody walks in with are not actually relevant to what you need. And here I'm speaking as a lawyer. People say, oh my God, here's a lawyer and we'll get all of our legal needs met. Well, I was a real estate lawyer, so I actually had something to contribute directly to the real estate questions faced by the Lakeview YMCA. But under ordinary circumstances, you will have a wide range of legal questions face your board, and no one lawyer will be able to answer any of them or all of them. A lawyer who knows a lot about litigation does not know poop about insurance and liability questions. Very few lawyers know anything about nonprofit governance unless they are lawyers who make their living advising nonprofits. And so they're not terribly likely to show up on your board. And so before you say to yourself, look at this person with this relevant skill, make sure the skill actually is relevant, because it isn't always. The other thing to make sure of is that the person who's coming to you wants to exercise her regularly scheduled skill rather than to learn a new skill. I mean, I spend all of my time writing, so you assume that what I want to do is write your annual report. But what I really like to do is figure out how to create a website, and that would be new to me. And I'm happy to learn it. I'm happy to do all of the background work necessary to learn it. But please don't throw me to what I'm bored with doing, that I do 45 hours a week or 60 hours a week already. Certainly, you don't have to make a decision about putting people on the board. You can always put people on committees, but the same cautions apply. Make sure that people are actually interested in what you're asking them to do, and make sure that they have broad skills. I mean, lawyers are not always smart, but they have some useful analytical skills. So you can certainly put them on committees where you want them to do some analyzing, instead of putting them on committees where you want them to be lawyers. And likewise, accountants have skills with respect to finances that aren't always tapped automatically in the work that they do. So committee service is always a good thing to think about. but it's not necessary. I know that often the only thing we can think of to do with high-skill volunteers is to throw them on the board or put them on a board committee, even if they're not committee members. That is not always the best use. People don't always want that version of collegiality, and particularly board service, which comes with an implicit or explicit requirement of giving money, may or may not be something that your high-skill volunteer is willing to talk about. Now, ultimately, volunteers are going to give you a lot of money, and probably all of you know that. But it's probably best not to ask them initially for money unless they come to you and say, what I'd like to do is board service. The reason to put them on committees is that you get to audition them for board service and find out before it's too late whether in fact they are really committed to your agency, whether they have the right skills, and whether they can do what it is that you need done. Next slide, please. I feel like a professor. Next slide, please. Okay, so now we're going to talk about something that nobody ever likes to talk about, which is that there's often a lot of tension between staff and volunteers. And, some of it is acknowledged, oh, I'm a staff member, I'm too busy to deal with these volunteers. But often the difficulties are not acknowledged. And the difficulties are ones of status. The difficulties are ones of fear on the part of staff members that they will be replaced by people who are willing to work for free, right? Recognize the threat posed to paid laborers by free labor. I should put that in 86-point type, because you really need, as an executive director or a program person or a volunteer coordinator, to make sure that your existing staff understands that these people are supplements and complements to what they do. They are there, volunteers are there to make your staff look good and to make their lives easier. And getting that across is perhaps the most important thing that you need to do in using high-skill volunteers, because otherwise you will find that people are threatened enough by the presence of these people who have skills but don't need to be paid, that they will sabotage the work of the high-skill volunteers. They won't even necessarily sabotage it consciously, but they will sabotage it because people are afraid of losing their jobs. I mean, I can't make it more simple than that. I mean, one of the difficulties is that anybody who has significant time to volunteer is more privileged than your staff members. By definition, your staff members are, underpaid and overworked, and these people have time to give away. And that's why it's so important to find new projects for high-skill volunteers, not just for their sake, but for the sake of the staff. If a volunteer is doing something the staff wasn't doing to begin with, that person is more likely to be greeted and treated as a colleague than as a threat or an interloper. And if the volunteer is doing something the staff was doing to begin with, no amount of assurance by the volunteer or the volunteer coordinator will prevent the staff supervisor from thinking that the volunteer is like, you guys have seen that movie All About Eve, right? Eve comes in and she's going to help this woman do everything. And what she's really doing is gunning for the woman's job. So it's very important for you to get across that the volunteers are not auditioning for the staff members' jobs. And while we're on the subject, it's very important for executive directors and volunteer coordinators to make clear to the volunteers that they are not auditioning for jobs, whether the job's being held by the people who are supervising them or any other job. It's important to make people understand that this is not an audition. Now, between you, me, and the doorknob, and there's kind of a large doorknob here, Of course, if the time comes that you have a job opening and somebody who's been volunteering with you applies for the job, are they more likely to get a full hearing than somebody who's a total stranger? Of course. But make sure that nobody thinks that this is a way in the back door to work for you, because again, that will create more tension with between staff and volunteers. Next slide, please. If you involve the entire staff in identifying projects for these people, they will feel like they have more control. They will understand that the role of the volunteers is complementary, and they will be more receptive to the arrival of these people. And as you see, I jumped ahead to discourage permanent job ambitions because life is not an audition. Next slide, please. So now we're on to how to make high-skill volunteers happy. Because if you're going to do all this work to bring them on board, you want to make sure that they stay and do something useful for you. And so I have coined this, not very exciting idea of the Big Mac. And that is meaningful work, autonomy, and collegiality. Next slide, please. The M in MAC is meaningful work. And by meaningful, I mean important to the organization and allowing for the use of the volunteer's skills. Unfortunately, sometimes when you say to an executive director or a volunteer coordinator, we need meaningful work, what they think you mean is people who are coming to them with their drab, wretched lives and need to be made to feel like their life is not wasted. That's not what we mean. Seriously, you are entitled as a volunteer coordinator and executive director, a program staff member, to ask people to do work that is important to the organization. And if you don't have any such work, you are not required to pretend that you do. But that's why to get you involved in identifying the projects to begin with, and in matching this individual volunteer with the project for which his or her skills are going to be the most useful. So that's the M in MAC, and it's perhaps more important than any of the rest of it. Nobody wants to have their time wasted. All of us know that. And volunteers are no more likely to want to have their time wasted than anybody else. Next slide, please. The A in MAC, autonomy. Now, in the time of COVID-19, people ordinarily end up with more autonomy than they want. So you may think to yourself, why is she emphasizing this? First of all, COVID-19 will not last forever, although it really feels like it to all of us right now. Second of all, even at a distance, people want the opportunity to organize their own work. And, you get to say the bylaws, God save us, the bylaws need to be revised by June 30th. But, don't micromanage people, because if you do, you'll lose them. These are grown-ups. You have chosen them specifically because they have the skills necessary to get this project done. Let them organize it. Now, having said that, of course, you need to check in with them. You need to make sure that your volunteer leader is using the skills of the volunteers reporting to them. I mean, you don't send people out into the universe and then 6 months later call them back and say, how you doing? Obviously, you need to stay in touch with them. That is easier when they're coming into the office, but obviously it's possible over Zoom, over the phone, by carrier pigeon. I mean, there's always a way to stay connected to people, but over connection is less of a problem now than it was before COVID, and then it will be after COVID. Because we do have a tendency, I was an executive director and I've been a volunteer coordinator, and I'm attracted to both of those things because I'm a control freak. And because we're all control freaks, it's hard to say to someone who is a relative stranger, I am going to trust you with this, and I'm going to let you do it your way. Obviously, there's a balance between, letting them go off on their own frolic and detour and over managing them. But please be cautious. I think autonomy is particularly important to adult high skill volunteers. It's something, for example, that is not as important to provide when you're supervising interns or, young people who are doing their service requirement, because they are young people and they're going to expect some substantial supervision. Grown-ups sometimes have a real hard time with supervision. And so balancing autonomy and supervision is going to be a challenge, but one that I know that you all can meet. Next slide, please. Collegiality and community. And this, of course, is the opportunity to belong to a team and be included. Again, this is more of a challenge now than it was before COVID, and that it will be after COVID, because it's easier to form teams when people get to see each other in person. I mean, I have all the respect in the world for Zoom, but it's not the same as sitting in a conference room together. It's just not. Now, maybe that reveals me just to be an old lady who doesn't, adapt very well, but team building, I think, is more important and more readily accomplished in person. In any case, it can be accomplished right now on Zoom, on the telephone, and this is the importance of the volunteer leader. Creating a team, and all of you know this because you all create teams for a living, creating a team is a very specific skill, and it takes a very specific skill. So you want to find somebody who knows how to make people feel included. And that will mean you want to find somebody who is able to orient other volunteers, who is able to work through the volunteer handbook or amend or update the volunteer handbook so that everybody understands what is expected of them, and so they can all do it. And I have a great belief in jokes. So, I've managed a team of volunteers where our job was to recruit a certain number of other volunteers. I know it sounds like infinite regress, but sometimes that's what you do. Well, every time we succeeded in recruiting somebody, we rang a bell in the office. I mean, I know that sounds silly, but that was one of our bonding mechanisms. So people got acknowledged when they achieved something, and everybody joked about it. There are all kinds of ways to build in jokes in a team. And the more that you do it, the more people will feel committed to the team. And to some extent, it's easier for people to get committed to the team than to get committed to your organization as a whole. It's a step-by-step process. I mean, obviously, they care about the work of your organization or they wouldn't be there. But it's easier for them to say, okay, it's our job to plan the spring benefit than to think it's our job to serve the clients of this organization, because overwhelmingly, your volunteers, no matter how high skill, are not going to be doing direct client work. Partly that's an issue of confidentiality, partly that's an issue of continuity, and it's something that we can talk about further in the question and answer. But I think in general, you need to think of your volunteers as people who are not interacting directly with your clients and therefore need other ways to feel connected to the organization. And collegiality, community, coming through the team will make that a lot easier. Next slide, please. So what do we get, right? We are the hardworking staff, and we're providing all this, the Big Mac and the rest of it, but what do we get? Well, if you're lucky, and not only lucky, but thoughtful, you will get enthusiastic and experienced help. It's one thing to teach an intern to, work on translating something, but it's another thing to put together a team that will think about how to reach out to different cultures and different racial groups and ethnic groups, right? There are things that adults are just aware of that interns are not going to be aware of. Now, interns are wonderful. I'm not dissing them. I just don't happen to be talking about them right now. What you get with grownups is multidimensional thoughtfulness about the work that you do. Now, sometimes that's kind of annoying, and you guys all know this from your boards of directors. Boards of directors say, hey, have you thought about blah, blah, blah? And of course, you've been thinking about blah, blah, blah since the year zero. And how could they possibly ask you anything that dumb? So that it seems kind of annoying to have people enthusiastically make suggestions. But most of the reason it's annoying to have people enthusiastically make suggestions is that they're asking you to do something you don't have time for. People who are enthusiastically making suggestions about things they will do are an amazing resource. They really are. So the person who came to me and said, I know we're doing this food pantry in Rogers Park and we're only doing it part-time, but I know, I've lived in Rogers Park forever, and I know a place where we can do this full-time. And by the way, that is accessible to people with disabilities. That's the kind of depth that you get from high-skill volunteers who have experience in the real world. The second thing, and this is extremely important, is high-skill volunteers are a link to the community that you may not get through your board. I was just on a conference call yesterday where we were talking about diversification of boards and diversity, equity, and inclusion issues with boards of directors. And those are an enormous challenge, at least in part, because we have a nonprofit system that relies on boards of directors to give and get money. And your community may not always be in a position to give or get money, but you still need to have them represented in your organization. You still need their lived experience. You still need the knowledge that they provide to make sure that we're not operating as, the Lady Bountiful and the poor, pathetic, people who are being served. That may have been okay in 1950. It's certainly not okay in 2021. We, nonprofit staff members and board members, are in service to our broader community. And anything that provides us with additional understanding of the community is something that we could not possibly do without. And so when you talk to prospective volunteers, please emphasize not just kind of traditional credentials, do you have an accounting degree? Do you have a law degree? Have you worked in advertising? But also lived experience. What do you know about the community we serve? What do you know about the community we work in? And here I'm using community in the broadest possible sense. So we could be talking about a location. We could be talking about a group of people with something in common, like a particular disability or a particular concern like domestic violence. The important thing is to bring in new voices, because as good as your staff is, and as strong as your board may be, there is always something that you might be missing. And particularly in a community that is as segregated as the Chicago metropolitan area, any opportunity to bring in someone whose racial background is different from most of your staff members, or whose ethnic background is different, or who speaks a different language, or who has been educated in a different way, any of those opportunities will make the service that you provide to your clients much more valuable. And so that community link, again, perhaps if you don't take anything else away from what I'm saying, the use of high skill volunteers is a link to the community that you need. And finally, you will get a long-term loyal donor. Now, the fundraising specialists among you are, sitting in your offices going, well, duh. But you will find staff members, board members who say, oh my God, we can't ask the volunteers for money. We're already asking them for time. Well, right. And you all know this. This is not, rocket science. But you do need to reiterate it to people who don't know it, which is that people who give time are more likely to give money, and will give money in the long term, and will talk to other people about giving money. That's, once again, that's the link to the community. They will be ambassadors for you. Now, some of them are going to be people that you explicitly choose as ambassadors, because what you're going to say is, the project I'd like you to work on is running a speakers bureau. I want you to go out and talk to the community and organize a bunch of other people to talk to the community about how fabulous we are, because we don't have time to do that. But even if they are not explicitly ambassadors for your brand and for the work that you do, they will be, because as any retailer will tell you, people talk about good experiences they've had. Unfortunately, people talk more about bad experiences they've had. And so that's the reason that the conversation that we're having right now matters. If you use your high skill volunteers well, they will tell 2 or 3 other people, maybe more. Maybe they'll go out and recruit other volunteers, and they will talk about your organization, and that will be great. If you use them badly, they will tell 10 other people, and that will be a real cost to your organization. So one of the things, next slide, please, that I am constantly reminding people about, oh no, I skipped a slide, forgive me, is, sorry, jumping forward, don't recruit high skill volunteers until you're ready to use them, because you don't want them to have a bad experience. Now, before you get around to obstacles to using them, A, you don't get to hire them, they hire themselves. Let's say people show up. I'm a great shower upper, right? I think to myself, I really want to help UNICEF. I've been giving UNICEF money. And so I'm going to call the local UNICEF office and say, hi, can I run a speakers bureau for you? UNICEF didn't know quite what to do with me. And particularly, they didn't know how to say, right now, we really don't have time for a speakers bureau, but we could use you to do blah, blah, blah. Or let us get in touch with you in 6 months when we've had a chance to think about doing a speakers bureau. So when you're dealing with people who hire themselves, be prepared to say, I can't use you right now. Never say, I can't use you, because you'll figure out how to use them. But it's better to send them away when you're not prepared than to take them in when you're not prepared and then not be able to use them correctly. On the subject of how to fire them, And I know that this is something that volunteer coordinators deal with every minute of every day. I have certainly dealt with it. All I can tell you is, don't be afraid to fire them. Set clear boundaries about what it is that you want them to do. If they overstep those boundaries, and they might, if you say, don't contact so-and-so without asking me, and then they do, maybe you give them one warning, probably you do, just like you would a staff member. And the second time they go over those boundaries, you fire them. And I know it seems awkward to fire people who aren't getting paid, but you absolutely positively have to do it. Particularly with high skill volunteers where you're using them as if they were staff members, you need to treat them as if they were staff members. And I know that this is something volunteer coordinators and executive directors know. It's something that substantive program staff are going to be nervous about. So, let them come to you, volunteer coordinator, and say, oh my God, this person just did blah, 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 and it's going to take me weeks to fix it. And then the volunteer coordinator does the firing, the substantive staff member, even if the substantive staff member is doing the supervising, which I recommend. The coordinator is the one who gets to fire them. A second obstacle to using volunteers, and this is connected to these issues about what the staff thinks of volunteers, is there's a tendency to think, if these people are so good, why aren't they working? Now, one of the very few good things about COVID-19 is that we know the answer to this question. The answer to this question is the economy shut down, so that there are lots of good people who aren't working. But when the economy opens up again, I suspect many of you will find this same level of what I heard somebody yesterday refer to as elegant resistance. People don't say to you, if they're so good, why aren't they working? They just come to work with high skill volunteers with great skepticism. And that is not the ideal way to start a working relationship. And so you need to, obviously a number of your high skill volunteers will simply be retired people. And that's easy enough to say the reason they're not working is they've retired. But, people have lots of reasons for wanting to change careers, to step out of the rat race, to spend more time with their children. And so there are a whole range of reasons why volunteers might be available that don't have to do with their being unemployable. So just let me, put that in your brain. The major obstacle to using volunteers, whether high skill or otherwise, is the supervisory burden. And I don't trivialize that. And you shouldn't either. So when executive directors and volunteer coordinators talk to substantive staff about what kind of projects they could use help with, it's important, to get them to think about that seriously so that, you can really help them. But it's also important to make sure that they understand that at least initially, they will need to spend time on this. And if the idea of spending any time at all in supervision makes them sick to their stomachs, then don't send them any volunteers. Now, first, work with them. I've done this as a consultant when I walk into places and talk about how to create a volunteer program. When I sit down with staff members, the first thing they say is, I don't have anything volunteers could help me with. And then as you talk, it turns out that there are plenty of things volunteers can help them with. So, don't be put off at the first negative response. On the other hand, if after you've talked through it, it's clear that another bit of supervision will be the straw that breaks the camel, back off and put your high-skilled volunteers somewhere else. I assure you there is some place in your agency where the supervisory burden will not be greater than the benefit that you're going to get. And, you know, like everything else, using high-skilled volunteers is a cost-benefit analysis. Once you've figured out that the benefit exceeds the cost, move forward and help your staff understand how the benefit will outstrip the cost. There's always a fear that people will quit. Here's the deal. Sometimes you hire people and they don't work out. That doesn't mean you never hire people again. Sometimes people whom you think are fabulous at their jobs quit. That doesn't mean you don't hire people who are fabulous at their jobs. Volunteers come and go, but honestly, they won't come and go any more frequently than your staff. If you treat them right, if you give them the work that they want or work that they come to love, there is no reason to think that they'll quit, provided that you don't micromanage them, provided that you don't let people sabotage them because they're afraid, you know, that they'll lose their jobs. Don't worry about it. In other words, volunteers will stay with you. I mean, I was a volunteer at Reporting for the Blind, and there were people there who had been volunteering since before I was born. People really, really get committed to agencies, and that is a benefit that you can't do without. Next slide, please. You all probably know better than I do where to find the kind of people I'm talking about, but let me just talk through it quickly. Professional associations, I think, are the greatest source of prospective high skills volunteers. And by that, I mean places ranging from the National Association of Women Business Owners to the Illinois CPA Society to the Advertising Council. These are all places that have a lot of high skill people and that can figure out ways to connect you to them. Now, some of them have their own, or, you know, at various times have had their own mechanisms for connecting high skill people to nonprofits. CPAs for the Public Interest, which was run by the Illinois CPA Society, is one example of that. Lawyers for the Creative Arts is another one. So don't hesitate to reach out to those organizations and tell them what you're looking for. Once you've done that, you know, review of what do we need done that isn't getting done, then you have something to hand to people and say, this is what we're looking for. Can you help us find them? Nonprofit fairs, which is where you find all your other volunteers, and of course they're virtual during COVID, is also a place to look for high skill volunteers. Likewise, Volunteer Match, Idealist, but the best place to find high skill volunteers is recruitment by current volunteers. Again, that means make sure that you've done the basic work. The basic work is stepping back, looking at your strategic plan, looking, and if there isn't a strategic plan, you know, talking through what is it that we need to get done that we're not getting done. And if the obstacle to doing that is we don't have the people to do it, write job descriptions, write project descriptions, and then go out and look for high skill volunteers to do that work. And that's why I say, don't look before you're ready. Make sure you know what you're looking for, because there's a tendency to say, oh yeah, volunteers, right? There are two extremes on this spectrum. There's volunteers are a waste of time, and there's we can always use more volunteers. Neither of those things are true. What's true is if you know what you need done, You can find volunteers to help you do it, and they will benefit you, you will benefit them, and your organization will be stronger for it. And that is what I have to say. So I'm happy to answer any questions, respond to any comments. I wasn't able to look at the chat while I was talking because, of course, I was talking. So if I haven't responded to things that you wish I talked about, let's talk about those now. I do want to say one thing that connects to what got said last month. One of your speakers talked about the importance of the invitation to participate, making prospective volunteers feel welcome, feel engaged, and understand that they are necessary. I think almost everything that I've said today is a specific iteration of the invitation to participate. So again, if you do nothing else, think about the importance of making people feel welcome and of how the work that you're asking them to do makes them feel a part of the important work that you're doing.
Thanks so much, Kelly. That was fantastic. Really, thank you for your presentation. We're going to move into the moderated discussion section. So I will share information about our discussion moderator, which is going to be Martesha Brown, who's the Director of Advancement for the Rockford Area Visitors and Convention Bureau. And Martesha, if you want to take it away, you can go right ahead.
Absolutely. Thank you, Billy. And thank you so much, Kelly, for this presentation. I have 3 pages of notes. I'm taking plenty of notes here, and very, very exciting conversation as it surrounds just this whole concept of making sure that a volunteer not only feels welcome and comfortable, but they also are working on a project and not just some of those tasks. Before we dig into the aha moments that we've had, Kelly, there was a question that was listed in the comments that I just want to kick off with. And this was actually from Marcia, and it was surrounding that idea of individuals not having anything that volunteers can help with, as well as once they do have something that a volunteer can help with, how exactly do you get that person comfortable with delegating and not complaining about why they're being overworked? The exact question for you, Kelly, is how do you convince people to delegate and let go, even though they complain about being overwhelmed?
That is such a great question. And it's probably the fundamental question of all management. I think if staff members, like any other human beings, feel heard about what they need and what they're currently doing, it will be easier for them to categorize what they can let go of as against what they can't let go of. And nobody is going to delegate the central thing that they work on, and you don't want them to delegate the central thing that they work on. What you want them to do is understand that the central thing that they work on is made up of a bunch of discrete parts, and that at least one of them might be peeled off. I guess my real answer to that question is you do it one step at a time. You don't suggest to somebody that she, take on a team of 17 volunteers and have them do something enormous. You say, oh, that one project needs somebody to outline what's involved in it. Can I give that to a volunteer? And so you're sort of tiptoeing into the process of defining the project. And the more collaboration there is between the staff member and the volunteer, the high skill volunteer, the happier both of them will be. Is that responsive? It's such a difficult problem, but I think it is the same management problem that you experience, with any staff member, and that it's no different doing it getting people to delegate is hard. And the way you get people to delegate is have them do it a little at a time.
Absolutely. I think that that is a great answer. Want to move into what we usually do, Kelly, when we kickstart our discussions is the aha moments. And so I just want to open it up to everyone. What was one of those aha moments where the light bulb went off during this presentation?
Oh my God, I stupefied everybody.
So
Well,
I'm just going to put a little levity into the conversation. I do want to say thank you, Kelly, for helping us to expand our thinking around using high skill volunteers. And my comment is, I had no idea that real estate attorneys could be so entertaining. So thank you. I'm married to one, so I have some expertise in the area.
All right, very good, very good.
I love it. Well, anyone else want to share an aha moment? I know there were a few that were listed there in the chat, and I can share those as well.
Kelly, I can share one, and I'm looking right at two of them, okay? I have two volunteers that are on this opportunity this morning, and they are both volunteers that have high skills, and they provide me the luxury of sitting back and watching them work. Does it take a great deal of work as a volunteer supervisor to do this? Yeah, but the benefits are worthwhile. So my aha moment, if I haven't said thank you to the two of them, is thank you both, Mark and Barb, you're terrific.
Yeah, we're not a pain in the ass.
No, you're not. Thank you.
Well, and that's such an important comment because, of course, as I was blabbering along, I did not talk about the importance of thanks. The main, sorry, my brain just went loop. The main benefit that high skill volunteers get, of course, is the opportunity to do the work. But I have never met anybody who got tired of hearing thank you.
Awesome. We have a couple of aha moments that were listed here in the chat, and maybe we can expand upon it. Let's see here. Jennifer mentioned an aha moment is when that volunteers are an opportunity and not a problem. Absolutely, absolutely. Terry mentioned the reiteration that volunteerism develops community. I don't know if Terry is here, if Terry's able to join us and maybe share and expand upon that. I don't know if she has access to do that.
Here I am.
There you go.
Hi.
Hi, Terry.
I just, it's something that I kind of have seen both ends of it. My previous job, we had a huge community who really volunteered, and it was easy because we had that dynamic of, I worked for the Farm Bureau. It was a community of farmers who wanted to participate, and the more we made them feel important, the more they wanted to volunteer for us. On this end, working where I do now, the community is something that we're looking to build, and trying to find those dynamic volunteer opportunities instead of just be the bag checker at our event.
Right.
Is a challenge sometimes. So it's nice to just be reminded. I work for Napier Settlement. It's a living history museum in Naperville.
Oh, yes. Okay.
So that's just it's nice to be reminded of my views are right in some manner, and that I'm on the right trail on that. So
awesome. Thank you for sharing that and expanding upon that. There was also a comment that Billy shared that said, I love that reminder that if staff are not ready to supervise a volunteer, you need to cultivate that skill in your staff before you give them volunteers. Kelly, can you expand on the importance of that a little bit more?
Again, this comes out of my own experience of being supervised by somebody who was very uncomfortable with my skills. I think the primary difficulty, and maybe I'm over personalizing, but at least in my experience, the primary difficulty that staff members have in supervising volunteers is this fear of being replaced. I don't actually think it's a failure of supervisory skill, because it's just not all that difficult if the project has been defined to turn the project over and check in on a regular basis. I mean, those are all kind of basic skills. The challenge comes in people's fear that they're going to be shown up, or they're going to be outclassed, or all kinds of fears that they won't admit to. And so I think it really falls to the executive director and to the volunteer supervisor, to the volunteer coordinator, to make clear that this person, this volunteer, is there to make you look good. And again, that's something you just can't say often enough.
Yeah, I completely agree with that, Kelly. It really is getting back to that mindset and thought that that volunteer that's there is really to be a benefit for the entire organization and the work that is being done and that's being completed. And so there may be opportunities to shift that mindset if a team member is feeling a little bit threatened, getting it back to the basics and helping them to understand we're here for those that we are serving. So I couldn't agree more with that. There was a, yes, go right ahead.
This can be done in a variety of ways. One of them, it can be done in a volunteer coordinator training, which is the paid staff or non-paid staff that are part of that team on there, and that establishes a couple of things. And another one is, I totally agree with you, Kelly, that needs to come from the executive director or the COO. They need to make sure that the paid staff members know that volunteers will not replace them. And three, volunteers in their orientation need to know that there are methods for them to gain the skills, knowledge, resume tending, etc., for them to get jobs when they're posted, but it will be their job to, again, go through the same process as anyone else to apply for those positions. So there are three ways to help establish that teamwork that it should be established between volunteer staff and paid staff. And we at the district like to call them non-paid staff versus paid staff.
Right.
I like that. I like that. Any other aha moments before I dig into more questions?
Yes. I thought I had typed everything in, but it didn't work. This is Pam Thompson, and I work with United Way. And the aha moment was how to use your highly skilled volunteers, and even those who do not have the high skills. My thing is to get everybody on board on staff, that's our staff members, to understand the importance of volunteerism. That is rather hard, and I have some that like to give volunteers, high skilled volunteers, these little tedious jobs, and they do not come back.
Right, right.
Or they will say to you, I'm a volunteer. That is not something I'm going to come and do. So I really appreciate everything you said this morning, Kelly.
Thank you.
Kelly, that brings up a thought that I wrote down as one of my aha moments, is just the that volunteers will share if they had a good experience, and they will share even more if they had a bad experience.
Yeah.
Does anyone else think that? I would think that that holds true. Does anyone have any stories that they like to share, or just examples of how they were able to provide a very good experience for a volunteer and they shared and it increased your volunteer pool? Or rather, if there's any of the other example, I will, sometimes that's a little easier to remember.
Hey, Barb, can I share one about you? Thank you. So Barb came to the district maybe close to 20 years ago, and I set her up with a volunteer department coordinator who couldn't find the time to meet with her for an orientation, interview, things like that, because that particular volunteer coordinator did not work weekends. Barb was also a teacher, and she did work during the week. So to make, let's coin the lemons out of lemonade, I actually worked with Barb so that she could start at another facility that had a weekend volunteer coordinator who could meet with her. And she's with us today. Thank you, Barb.
Love it, love it. Any other examples that we want to share?
I'll share one. So I had spent 10 years working with adults with intellectual disabilities, and many of them participated in Special Olympics. And as we know, staff are very busy and often overworked. So I worked really hard to find parents and extended family members that wanted to be coaches and volunteers. And I got that core 2 or 3, and really they loved it. They advocated with a lot of other parents, and it ended up where we had maybe 20, 30 parents and family members and siblings that came out to help volunteer to be coaches and do things for Special Olympics that they had never been asked or offered to do before. And it really strengthened relationships between families, which was great, and then built some better advocates for our organization that I worked for.
Great example. Great example. And that gets me to this next question. How are you guys identifying your volunteer opportunities? Is there a discussion at the board level? Are your team members getting together? How are you guys right now identifying your volunteer opportunities?
For the past year, it's been a little bit covert with COVID. So just gathering in small groups that can work together.
How are you guys identifying those skills? The opportunities for volunteers to come and partner alongside you? Well, maybe we'll start with, what are the volunteer opportunities that you currently have? So take it away, Ms. Johnson.
That's been a tough question with the COVID this past year. We literally, the last 6 months, have not allowed volunteers in our building. So that's really limited what we could do. We were able to reach out to some other organizations who are using volunteers in outdoor settings or in very socially distanced settings. So we've been able to place volunteers in other places. But it's been a tough kind of haul this past year, and it's been a real learning experience, especially since this is our first year with this program.
What program is it?
I'm with a retired and senior volunteer program. It's part of AmeriCorps.
Oh, of course, of course.
Yeah, so we literally started the program in April at the beginning of this shutdown.
Right.
Yeah, so it's been an interesting year.
And, you know, I wish I had some magic thing to say about that, because I know that lots of meaningful volunteer activities simply cannot be pursued until, you know, things are a little bit better. I have faith that things will be a little bit better in a couple of months. But, you know, I worked with a food pantry where volunteers did all of the packing and service to the clients and so on. And, you know, we stopped being able to have them come in.
Mm-hmm.
But what we discovered was that there were other ways that people could reach out from, you know, from their homes to provide service. So stuff that we had done from a central location, we started doing from individual homes to individual homes. But boy, nothing is easy. I mean, it was adaptation on the fly.
Yep, it really was. We started a friendly caller program where we have volunteers calling shut-ins once a week just to chat and see how they're doing.
We had about 208 volunteers that volunteered in the iRead program. And when school began again, they did not allow volunteers in. And that's a lot of volunteers to say, bye-bye, it's nothing that we can do. But throughout the year, I did find like Rock House Kids. We have the Boys and Girls Club who's doing virtual learning, and volunteers can come and sit beside. So that helped, but I don't think all 208 got placed. But it's really been hard for, and especially when you call a volunteer just to see how they doing. I'm stuck in my house with nothing to do,
Right.
you know, or I'm afraid to go out. So it's really been a hard time, and I can't wait till it's over.
Do we think that there may be an opportunity, especially now, and I'm kind of doing some self-reflection with some of the things that I work with volunteers. Is this an opportunity for us to maybe chat with our teams, chat with our leadership team and say, what are some of those special projects? What are some of those projects that can be done right now during the pandemic? If you're anything like me, I always have things that are on this like wish list on the side here. And how can we take some of those wish list items and actually pair them with some of those skilled volunteers? It just really makes me think if some of those phone calls that we're making to check in with the volunteers, and I'm speaking on myself, if I can call those volunteers and get a better understanding of their skill set and how they may be able to help out with some of those wish list projects. It's a good time to sort of get some of those things done. So I know Harlan had a question. He asked, let me see here. He said, several organizations are pure volunteer with no paid staff. They are often under-resourced, or they may have chosen to be all volunteer. Any suggestion for them? And Harlan, you may want to expand on that question.
Yeah, I'm a member of ER 815, Eliminate Racism 815, the Parker Woods Neighborhood Association, the local unit of NAACP, the Northern Illinois Institute for the Healing of Racism, and the Winnebago County Action Team. All of these are nonprofit organizations, either incorporated or not, that have no paid staff. Most of them don't know how to even develop a paid staff. Others have chosen to be pure volunteer, and
Right.
yet they have big challenges. So your presentation was wonderful, and it was very specifically addressed to organizations that do have a paid staff. And I'm wondering if you yourself or you know someone else who might be able to address these issues, because they're much more painful than the issues that you've addressed.
Well, I mean, I have certainly worked with organizations that are all volunteer. You're right. I wasn't addressing those today.
That's okay.
I think in some ways, the all volunteer organization is, if you have a couple of good volunteer leaders, the all volunteer organization in some ways is easier to manage, because you don't have any of these issues of threat and competing status and all that kind of nonsense that I talked about. But, you know, that's kind of a big if. Organizations that don't have strong volunteer leadership will blow apart. You know, it really is incredibly important to have one or two people who have the broad picture of what the organization is supposed to be and do, and to make sure that that broad picture is shared widely with everybody who constitutes the organization. Now, you know, in some places that's perfectly clear. You know, my main experience with all volunteer organizations is political campaigns. And, you know, organizing a whole group of people to advocate for the passage of the Voting Rights Act, it's not all that complicated to get everybody to understand what it is we're doing. All we need to do is figure out, you know, the how. And, you know, it can be a little bit like herding cats to figure out how when it's an all volunteer group. But if everybody is committed in a goodwill, in a good faith fashion to the goal, you can usually hammer out the steps towards the goal based on that. But again, I'm a big believer in volunteer leadership. I know that there's a lot of talk about, consensus and making decisions by consensus. And of course, you want everybody to get on board with the main thing that you're doing, but there always has to be a leader who's, pointing out the direction that we need to go. I mean, one of the things that I usually say, and this is about paid staff, but it can also be true about volunteer leadership, is that volunteers can move mountains provided there's somebody there with shovels and safety glasses and a map to the place you're trying to go. So maybe that is I think that's equally true of all volunteer organizations. Is that responsive?
I can't agree with you more, because we have volunteers this past year that did 200 to 400 plus hours, and all the majority of that time was non-paid volunteers getting together. But we had there's a core group of leaders in that were the glue, and so very little resources were required from the organization, overhead, but we were able to still get together and accomplish our goals and continue to work in a safe manner. And had the training and liberty to actually work in that format, which was very rewarding.
Would you say that it's valuable for an all-volunteer organization to do their best to capitalize enough and hire people, or in your experience, have you seen a lot of all-volunteer organizations function just fine that way, and it might be less effective if they had paid staff?
Yes, there are certainly organizations that, not everything needs to grow to the next level. I mean, I know, we're all Americans and we're like, oh, bigger is better. But, some organizations work just fine as they are. I mean, I think about things like the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. I mean, obviously they have, these big institutions, but fundamentally, the unit is the den, or whatever you call that, the
Just like
local
the
group.
NAACP, that they're like that too. We're like that too. Local
Right.
units of the NAACP almost never have paid staff.
Right, exactly. And there's no reason to. I mean, there are things, I'm a supporter of the NAACP as well. I mean, obviously there are things the national organization needs to do, the Inc. fund, right? All the litigation.
Oh, many things, yeah.
But, for people who are committed to racial justice, it's not at all clear who needs to be paid to do what. As individuals, you're going to advocate. And in some ways, as autonomous individuals, you can be more powerful than if you were confined by a corporate structure. So yeah, no, I'm a big believer in the power of volunteers to do on their own what they need to.
Kelly, kind of along those same lines, just thinking about this whole volunteer being the leadership, how do we use a volunteer to be a volunteer coordinator? And I also open that up to everyone else as well. How do you utilize a volunteer to be a volunteer coordinator?
Well, let somebody else take that for the moment while I think about it.
Hey.
No worries. Is there anyone else here that may be utilizing a volunteer to be the volunteer coordinator or something similar to that?
We are, and Barb, you need to answer this one, and Mark, you need to answer this one because you
What?
both coordinate volunteers.
I mean, that's why I teed it up. I mean, we survived all of this past year as volunteers, and we had no paid staff working on the days that we got together, and it went on. We, racked up a lot of hours just by managing ourselves. But we had good leadership, good training
Right.
that went into that, and then the liberty to be allowed to get together, that made it successful.
Yeah, resource management in our area did a lot of wonderful work. They've cleared out a lot of invasives, restored a lot of prairie areas. Those guys worked really hard over this past year, but Renee has been gracious to allow several volunteers, quite a few as a matter of fact, to be volunteer coordinators. And with that, she saw leadership skills within the volunteer and said, hey, would you like to try this? And working alongside with us for a few events and things like that, just to, make sure that we were going in the right direction. And then all of a sudden it's like, well, I've got to go out and visit my mom. ShareFest is coming up. Here you go. It's your bag.
Right.
I'll give you the list of people. This is what you need to do, and go for it. And it's been great. She's been able to not only have family time that she wouldn't be allowed to have, but she also has the idea that I have a successful volunteer here that knows how to place where placement needs to be. If an area is short, pull from here, put that person there. So, I mean, she's got that availability to, either go to a different event and let the volunteer run the coordination, or like I said, have a little bit of extra family time for whatever need be.
Right, right.
Mark
think,
steps,
I mean, the
Mark
thing
steps
that,
in a couple of these times too. We're able to have church groups, youth groups, corporate groups come out. I don't have to be there. His volunteer coordinator doesn't have to be there. He's able to do much of he's able to pick up equipment, to manage it, to check people in. Mark, you're amazing on here with all the work that you do for the district. Again, thank you.
well, and I think what you've identified, and this is the only contribution that I can make to it, is the trust between staff and volunteers. Once it exists, then again, volunteers can move mountains. If you know that your volunteer corps is skilled and committed, and if, within yourself, and now I'm speaking from a staff perspective, you can trust them and let go of your own control stuff, amazing things will happen. I mean, I really think we underutilize volunteers. I mean, it's not just that we use them to stuff envelopes when they could do other things, but that we instruct them sometimes more than they need instructing.
Very good points. Very good points. There were some comments here. Just want to make sure I touch on this. Renee mentioned that their magic moment is the fact that they have a lot of outdoor versus one-on-one social distance volunteering during COVID. We have volunteers with Zoom activities, photographers that can work social distancing. Tough to be a part if you have a lot of leaders and not enough people to do much of the legwork. And that you found that there are some great things to take from COVID in terms of smaller participation, and it's revealed greater learning, a remarkable return on investment for goals, and first-time volunteers returning, as well as trained staff. Very, very good point there. Anything you want to expand on that at all, Renee?
No, thank you for the opportunity. And it's a really, like I said twice, and hopefully your heads aren't getting too big. It's a pleasure and an honor to work with volunteers.
I think another success with that though is, having a foundation, so where people can, in our situation where you can work independently is in part because you have a foundation where you can put in for small grants to get tools, equipment to allow you to continue to work independently or as all volunteer groups and not have to rely on the more traditional structure where somebody else would be coming in with the equipment.
So there was another really, really good point that you brought up, Kelly. It was one of my other aha moments here on my notes, and that was surrounding diverse volunteers and the importance of emphasizing some of those untraditional credentials.
Mhm.
And I just want to ask to our general group, have you guys been implementing that and making sure that you're really focusing in on some of those untraditional credentials as it relates to volunteers? Or any suggestions, things that you'll want to do in the future?
I don't know if this would be unconventional, but when we used to do the volunteer fairs, the nonprofit fairs, people would come up to our booth and they'll see all the depending on the season. Usually in the spring, I'll bring seedlings, and we've got a pollinator visual that we bring, and we talk about resource management, clearing out invasives, and we also talk about our premier events too, where the general public comes in for the day and has fun out in the woods and all. But sometimes people come up to us and they say, well, there's nothing that I can do here, but I love your trails. And it's like, okay, do you bike? Do you walk? And they're like, oh, well, we do a little bit of both. And it's like, okay, you're out on our trails anyway. Why don't you become a trail sentinel with us? And they're like, well, what does that entail? And I give them a brief description, and they're like, you know what? That kind of sounds like fun. I said, sure, you're out there anyway, so why not? And it kind of, it's a win-win. They're out there enjoying the trails, and so why don't you give back a little bit? And same thing with photographers. I mean, there's always something in our area that we could find someone that, is working somewhere else. However, they've got an outside interest, and that would benefit us. So it's a win-win.
Barb, you mentioned that volunteer opportunity. I'm going to email you or Renee to become a trail sentinel for you guys. I love their trails. They're fantastic. Will County Forest Preserve, some of the best facilities. And I'm going to email you because that sounds like just right up my alley. So see, it all works. So I'll email you.
So, and Kelly, just can you expand just a little bit more on why it's so important to emphasize those untraditional credentials in getting diverse volunteers?
I guess I would say philanthropy and nonprofits, as we've professionalized, as we've gone from being, kind of back pocket into a bigger portion of the economy, has also corporatized a little bit. And I mean, I'm sure you've all heard this, right? People say, well, why don't nonprofits act more like businesses? I'm like, which business? Enron, which business would you like us to emulate? But I think one of the consequences of that is just like business, we're insufficiently diverse. And we find ourselves looking for people who look like us in every context. And so I think the sort of the volunteer version of affirmative action is to look around at what needs doing and strip it to its essentials and say, okay, what skills do you need? And once you've done that, the number of people or the variety of people who can answer that need is much bigger. The world is just not as narrow as we sometimes make it for ourselves. I'm not.
No, I agree, Kelly. I think when you said that, the reason it was a takeaway for me is, I would beg us to ask the question, are we looking at a resume, or are we looking at the skill sets that person has?
Right.
And when we start to look at that resume, we are really excluding a group of individuals that can really be an asset for our organizations. And so we have to open our minds up, as you mentioned, Kelly, to make sure that we're looking at those skill sets and not just looking at the resume and the titles that a person may hold. It definitely will exclude and limit our ability to have diverse volunteers at our organizations and agencies. Absolutely agree with that. Anyone else have any thoughts about that?
Martesha? I started out as a volunteer in one area, and as my confidence grew in that area, and I know I can speak for other volunteers as well, Renee has seen me take an interest in other areas. And she had said, you know, hey, would you like to try this? Okay, sure. And then she saw my confidence grow in there. And then she said, would you like to try something else? Or if I felt the confidence to move on, I would ask, and several others would say, hey, could I do this? Could I do that? And through that, she has a wonderful core of highly skilled volunteers that do a lot of different jobs, not just one or two. So I think acknowledging the idea that someone has the confidence within themselves to expand and grow, to give them that opportunity, and that also relieves a lot of pressure on a lot of different other people. When we would have our big events, the coordinators of those events could pull any one of the volunteers and say, can you leave this area? I need someone to go here to cover. And boom, there were 2 other volunteers there. Somebody else took off and left, and the position was filled. So I mean, when you have a lot of people or a select few that have confidence and knowledge of several different areas, it's an extreme asset to allow them to move and change and to incorporate those skills to make something move a lot easier.
Absolutely. And to continue to grow in those skills. I mean, for me, with one of the best organizations that I work for, they kind of have this behind the scenes concept of we hire for skills, but we hire for attitude, and we hire for the person's ability to grow. And so I think we can use that same mindset as it relates to volunteers. Can we get somebody in there with the right attitude and take the time to help them develop this skill so that they're prepared for some of those big projects, some of it even more meaningful work? I think that's something that we can all take on.
I just wanted to add to what Barb said, having that confidence, and that is real big for any volunteer. Some can come in with confidence, but you have a lot of volunteers who have a sincere heart, who really want to volunteer, but they have to have the confidence that you trust them with the task that you have given them. And I just think that was wonderful what you said, having that confidence and then that's how you grow to move on.
Absolutely. And I think part of that confidence is also making sure that your organization has a culture that welcomes them and that they feel like they belong. And you mentioned that too during your presentation, Kelly, especially when you're working with diverse individuals, there has to be this feeling of belonging. That feeling of belonging is going to resonate into having confidence in working with your organization. And so that was definitely a very, very key takeaway, is making sure volunteers feel like they belong. They're doing meaningful work. They are able to organize their own work and not have death by 1,000 cuts for micromanagement. Right. So that's one of my notes too. But like you said, an opportunity to belong to a team, to have some of those inside in jokes, and just be a part. So there's one final question that I'll ask, and we'll be wrapping up pretty soon here. I just want to ask if there's anything that you've taken away from this session that you plan to implement. What do you plan to implement or take away from this session?
I had put it in my chat, but I really did like the idea of possibly looking at a volunteer person to manage different portions of our opportunities. We have some after evening volunteers that want to come in and maybe garden or water plants and so on. And right now we don't know how we're going to manage them. And I wouldn't mind looking and seeing if there's some way for us to have a volunteer manage them during that time. And really a light bulb moment for me.
I see here in the notes here, an emphasis on cross-training. That's something that someone will be taking away. Again, focusing in on belonging, doing a better job of not micromanaging. That is definitely a key one there. I also see here it says, our CEO has made a huge change at the district with a business model. All departments, including volunteer services, now have business plans. It was very easy for us to transfer because we took the much needed time as a management team to develop a strategic plan, which was easy to transfer into the business plan. I think this was Renee. Do you want to touch on this a little bit?
About 10, if not more years ago, our volunteer coordinator team invited a person from Red Cross to come in and help us develop a strategic plan, which I think all volunteer service departments should have. It puts a lot of things in perspective for the team so that they can continue to manage, and that this team is a combination of paid and non-paid staff. So it puts everyone on a playing field that they're there because they have the skills to be there to manage volunteers. That I strongly suggest, if you don't have a strategic plan, to develop one, because it really makes your planning for the next or the following year work, and additions to or subtractions from positions that you currently have. And don't be afraid to delete a position if it's no longer needed on here. Also, don't be afraid to add a position, but make sure that any positions and or groups and or projects that you're adding on here go through the diligent process of what is needed, what are the components of the project, and who will manage that volunteer that of that project. That management can either be a volunteer or paid staff, but you need to have all those things in writing in the position description so that you can do a great job managing that. And Terry asked me for a gardener position description. Please email me. We do have gardeners, and I'd be more than happy to send that to you, as well as a volunteer department coordinator position description, because we do have we have several volunteers that do manage on there. So I'd be more than happy to send those to you.
I'm working on that email right now. Thank you.
Love it. Any other takeaways from today's session and really our discussion today? Or any other questions you might have?
I was going to share that I'm going to take a look at our wish list opportunities and look at ways that we have a recently established advisory group made up of nonprofit executives who are volunteers, right, for NICNE, advising the work that we do, and looking at ways that they might be able to take some of the tasks on our wish list and move initiatives forward.
Awesome. Great, great. Any other takeaways? I think we have one new message here. Catherine said, I appreciated that it was noted in the presentation, the differences between working with highly skilled volunteers versus younger volunteers, differences in how they want to be managed and what they get out of the work. Awesome, awesome. Definitely a very good takeaway. All right. Anyone else want to share any final thoughts? Well, Kelly, I do want to say I absolutely appreciated your presentation today. It was definitely very, very insightful. I will be thinking about Big Macs, and it's not just because of me being on a diet right now, but I will be thinking
Right.
about the meaningful work, the autonomy, and making sure that everyone feels that they belong. I will be thinking about that today, and it's just been really, really, really insightful having you here with us. So I thank you so much for that, Kelly.
The pleasure was mine. Thank you very much for inviting me to present. And let me know if you need me again.
Awesome, awesome. I'll hand it off to Billy. I think you have some additional announcements.
I do. Thank you again, Kelly. That was fabulous. Really appreciated the discussion from you this morning and from the group. And thank you, Martesha, for leading that conversation. So I'm going to share my screen. I have some more information for you about our next session coming up and about some upcoming programs that I'm sure you'd like to learn about. So our next session on April 7th will be led by Renee, which we can see in the room this morning. We're excited to have her lead that. It's going to be on growing staff and volunteer harmony. So planting new seeds to improve your culture. Our upcoming events, I will share something that is not on our list. On March the 18th, we have a panel discussion that will be led by Keri Asevedo, who wasn't able to join us this morning, but I know you're familiar with her. That is going to be on the eviction moratorium and then the impending eviction crisis that may be happening. So we'll be talking about what plans are in place, what resources are available, and then it's an opportunity to share any issues that you might be having or things facing your program participants. So if you're in Winnebago County, or even if you're not and you want to learn about what other counties are doing, please join us for that. Panel will be including the City of Rockford, Northwest Homestart, Prairie State Legal, Rockford Housing Authority, the Winnebago County Housing Authority, and then Housing Action Illinois. So
What's the date on that? What's the date again?
that will be on March 18th. So I will share information on how to register for that in the follow-up email with the recording with all of you. We also have free Courageous Conversation Facilitator training, which will start on March the 19th. That's a training with Dr. Tracy Ellis of Candid Conversations Matter. And she's going to run a workshop with Ellen Amer, a local facilitation expert, on how to facilitate difficult conversations about racial justice and social justice, or how to engage in them, and then leave with something positive at the end in constructive conversation. So that is free. There is still a few spots open. You can find it on our Eventbrite page, and I will also share the link with you. We have our certificate in nonprofit management program starting tomorrow. Very exciting. That is going to be leadership management and development, which is going to be led by Lori Burks Nelson. She has her CFRE and she has a master's in education with a focus in counseling. And we'll talk about nonprofit leadership. So if you're cultivating young leaders in your organization, or maybe you want to refresh your skills or broaden your social network, there is still time to register for that. We have on the 17th, it's a busy month. We have on the 17th, the Rockford Area Case Management Initiative. We have free community of practice each quarter. And Mary Cassiope, the executive director of One Body Collaboratives, is going to be presenting the complexities of poverty and the Bridges Out of Poverty framework. And then we have in April, our human resources management course. So if you are leading volunteers or leading staff, or maybe have staff that are learning to do those things, our next course will be led by Jeannie Weckerly, who is the HR director at Goodwill of Northern Illinois. So thank you. We thank you for your time this morning. And again, thank you to our sponsors, and we look forward to seeing you next month.
Thank you. Take care. Have a good week.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.